Today we're going to make an outdoor kitchen island out of steel, wood, and concrete. So my friends over at Traeger Grills asked me if I could make an outdoor kitchen island to celebrate the book launch from one of my favorite chefs, Amanda Haas. She does some really incredible stuff with the Traeger Grills, and be sure to check out her new cookbook. I'll put a link to that in the description box below. I'm going to start with the steel base. I'm using angle sections for the vertical supports on the corners and tube steel for the horizontal structural members. Welding goes a lot easier when the metal is nice and clean, so I use my angle grinder to remove any rust, mill scale, or dirt that had accumulated. I started by welding together the sides of the base, and I used magnet clamps in a square to guide me as I just lightly tacked the steel pieces together. I used a scrap piece of tube as a spacer to set the height for the bottom shelf. Now metal can move around a little bit while you're welding, so that's why I just like to tack things in at the beginning, then I check to make sure everything's still square before going back in and reinforcing the welds. This frame is going to have close to 600 pounds of concrete on it, so I flipped it over and made sure to reinforce the connections from both sides. Steel structures like this can be accomplished with just a few basic tools. I did all of my cutting and steel prep using an angle grinder. Amanda the chef had given me a few basic requirements for storing different grill accessories, and so I just cut pieces of tube steel to fit inside these initial frames and define the shelves and storage spaces. This Forney Easy Weld machine has served me really well on all my welding adventures. I made the container house using this. It's lightweight, easy to move, and available on Amazon. I'll put a link to it in the description box below. The first side panel is just about done, so I brushed out a weld just to check on my progress. Not perfect, but good enough. The end panels are made out of two different sizes of tube steel, and once again this process was just about double checking to make sure everything is square, tacking it, checking it again to make sure it's square, and then reinforcing the welds. The concrete pad that I'm working on isn't perfectly flat, so assembling the whole structure was going to be a little bit challenging. I started by just very lightly tacking in the end panels before adding the other side panel. This way I still have a little bit of flexibility so that if I'm not perfectly square, I can kind of bend it and use some clamps and kind of force it into square before reinforcing all the joints. I got it all tacked together, but it was getting pretty late and it was too dark to see how square it was, so I decided to leave that till the morning. I was pleasantly surprised by how well I got it just by eye, and so now I could go in and reinforce all the connections. I used some scrap pieces of wood as spacers to set some of the different shelves. I could have used a level, but my ground isn't perfectly flat, so I'd have to level out the whole structure and then use the level, so I just thought this was an easier way to keep things parallel. There's going to be two different slabs of concrete on the top, and it's not going to be symmetrically loaded, so I added in these reinforcing members to help provide rigidity to the whole steel base. Amanda wanted some vertical storage where she could store large drip pans and extra grills and racks. So I welded in some 1-inch angle steel that I could add wood dividers to later. I also used angle steel to add additional supports to each of the shelves. Angle steel is great for stuff like this too because it has a thin edge that you can drill holes through to secure material to from the underside. The structure was feeling pretty sturdy as it was, but I decided to add in one additional vertical member in the middle to help transfer the weight evenly and reduce deflection. I ground out the welds on the top so that my countertop surfaces could sit nice and flat. I then put a wire brush attachment onto an angle grinder and brushed down the entire steel structure to get it ready for primer. I then painted the structure with 2 coats of Rust-Oleum rusty metal primer. It was a little tricky reaching the inside bars, so I had Jesse put on a hazmat suit and get inside there and really get it from all the angles. While the primer was curing, I got started on making the molds for the concrete countertops. Just going to use melamine hot glued together, and I want them to be 3.5 inches thick, so I just ripped down some melamine on my table saw and then cut it to length on my compound miter saw. From here it's just about hot gluing the pieces together, and shout out to RYOBI for making a really awesome cordless hot glue gun. I place the pieces of melamine and then hot glue the outside edges. Check to make sure everything's square, and then hot glue in additional support pieces. I used to use screws as well, but I find that the hot glue is plenty strong for these types of slabs. And whenever you add screws to melamine, there's a chance that you can crack the surface a little bit, which would leave discoloration and a little bit of a weird texture on the concrete. I sealed the inside edges with black silicone caulk. I used to use clear, but the black is easier to see against the white, and it works really well when I even out the joints using a fondant tool. This is a simple tool used for decorating cakes. It has a steel ball on the end that you just press into the seams, and it gives you nice clean caulk lines. Once the caulk has cured, you can then just peel away the excess. Now the forms for the concrete countertops are 3.5 inches thick. Now I don't need that much thickness, and I want to reduce the weight as well. So I just doubled up some 3/4 inch thick plywood, glued and screwed it together, and then coated it with a few coats of polyurethane. This will give me a wood core that reduces weight and also makes it easy to attach these slabs to the steel structure. I cut some pieces of 3/8 inch rebar and then drilled screws into these plywood cores. This allows me to wire the rebar to these screws at just about 1/2 inch above the surface of the wood. This is going to go steel side down into the concrete molds, and I don't want it to sink too far, so I screwed on some scrap pieces of plywood that will rest on the edges of the concrete forms. I'm going to use Quikrete Countertop mix in gray for the countertops. This is a really high performance mix that has a strength of about 6,000 psi, which is more than double typical concrete. It's a fantastic, easy to use countertop mix, but you typically have to special order it from either Home Depot's or specialty masonry stores. So just call in and order it ahead of time and then pick it up when it gets there. We used a couple of hose and a mixing tray to mix it and then pushed it down into the molds. You really want to work it into all the corners and vibrate it as much as you can to get out the air bubbles. Once we were about 3/4 of the way full, we placed the wood core and then had to set weights on top of it so that the wood wouldn't float up to the top. We did the smaller slab first, and that took just a little over 3 bags. So we were starting to get a little worried about how heavy the big one was going to be. Not only did we have to build this entire island in a pretty short time window, I also had to deliver it from Joshua Tree, where we're building it, all the way up to Oakland, where Amanda lives. So figuring out how to get everything into the back of my Toyota Tacoma in one trip was part of the design process. The second plywood core really wanted to float up to the top, so we had to put a lot of weight onto it and really push hard to get it to sink into the concrete. Alright, back to painting while we wait for the concrete to cure. Jesse had a great idea of flipping it over on its side and doing the initial coat that way, and then flipping it right side up for the last few coats. We used the Rust-Oleum turbo spray system with a gloss white protective enamel. The turbo spray system is the next best thing to a professional setup. It gives you a really wide, consistent spray pattern, which makes it really easy to apply even coats. While we're waiting for the paint to dry, let me tell you about the sponsor for this video, Traeger Grills. Traeger Grills are really cool. They mix together really innovative electrical technology with a very clever use of natural fuel, in this case, compressed wood pellets. The result gives you incredibly precise temperature control that lets you either go slow and low, like a professional Texas-style pitmaster, or you can just crank it up really hot and cook in my more conventional and amateurish way. You just pour these wood pellets into the hopper on the side of the grill, and it uses a worm drive system to digitally feed in the wood pellets to maintain incredibly precise temperatures. And because it's electrical and relies heavily on the wood for the heat, I can just plug it into my Goal Zero system and do some solar powered grilling. I tested it out by grilling a tri-tip and some vegetables, and it worked phenomenally well. And as a bonus, you also get that nice wood smoky flavor, which just steps up your grilling game a bit. I'll put links to the grill that I have in the description box below, but check it out. They're really cool. All right, back to the build. We let the concrete cure for 3 days before breaking away the mold. The hardest part was just lifting up the slab because there's a little bit of suction between the still slightly damp concrete and the melamine. So we slid a board underneath it and then bent the board away to break the air suction, and then we're able to easily lift it up. I've had really good results using tropical hardwood for outdoor projects. So I ordered some Cumaru deck boards from Advantage Lumber. These boards are 1 inch thick and 5.5 inches wide, and they come pre-sanded, so all I have to really do is cut and rip them to the appropriate sizes. We set the fence on our table saw to about 2¼ inches and then ripped the pieces so that we could create a slatted top for the island. Jesse pre-finished all the pieces using teak oil. You just wipe on a really heavy coat, let it sit to penetrate for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then wipe off the excess. Cumaru is an affordably priced hardwood that does really well outdoors, and the color is just fantastic. I started assembling the wood tops by gluing on small spacer pieces to the Cumaru slats. I'm using Titebond Type 3 wood glue, which is waterproof. After gluing on the spacers, I then used clamps to help me assemble the slatted tops. The wood is really dense, so I pre-drilled holes before driving in 3 1/8 inch long finished screws. Only a couple of the screws will show from the outside, and for these ones, I countersunk the holes so that I could put in nice decorative stainless steel screws. I loaded it up into the truck and then had a nice 8-hour drive up to Oakland. My Tacoma has a 6-foot long truck bed and a decked drawer system installed in it. The concrete slabs were wrapped in moving blankets and were directly on the bed, and then the steel structure went over them. The steel base weighed around 200 pounds and wasn't that difficult to move. I highly recommend this deck system. It allows you to have easy access to tools that are stored under the payload that you're delivering. I have all the tools I need for the install loaded into these drawers, and they slide really easily because they use skateboard wheels for the drawer mechanism. Seriously, this system's awesome. Check it out. It's so cool to be able to access waterproof storage underneath almost 1,000 pounds of cargo. The install went pretty easy. I just flipped the steel base over and then screwed through the angle steel and into the Cumaru deck boards. I'd already pre-drilled most of these holes, so it went really fast. I was very relieved to see that the concrete hadn't cracked during the long drive, so we unloaded those and placed them on the steel base. I wasn't worried about these sliding at all. They're so heavy that it's actually really difficult to slide them on top of the steel, but I still added a few screws through the angle steel and into the plywood cores just to be on the safe side. I added the slatted top pieces and then also screwed that to the steel base as well. I added in the slats that'll serve as the dividers for the vertical storage, and then was ready to finish the island by sealing the concrete with paste wax. I just applied a really heavy coat, let it sit for 10 minutes, and then rubbed out the excess. I'm really excited with how this project came out. It looks super clean and modern, and Amanda has 2 big, nice, flat concrete work surfaces with really nice slatted, polished wood in between. The whole thing can be rinsed off with a hose, and I can't wait to see what Amanda does with this. This was a time-consuming process that involved a lot of steps, but none of them were that difficult or required expert precision. Also, the entire build required less than $350 in materials. If you want to see what we're working on next, be sure to follow us on Instagram. Check out some of our other videos, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Thanks! Bye!